Hello, ladies and gentlemen. If you are watching, thank you so much for continuing to watch the Women of Influence Summit 2021. I am your host, Kimberly Lawson of Lawson Learning Academy, and I have with me during this interview none other than the extraordinaire Maya Simmons Rogers. Hi, Maya.
Hi, Kim. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I can't complain.
So tell the viewers a little bit about you.
Okay. Well, I am a practicing attorney. I graduated from Florida A&M with an accounting degree, and I also got my master's in business administration from Florida A&M. And then after that, I went to law school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which was very freezing. And so I decided at that point that I did not want to live in the Midwest. So I came back to Atlanta to start practicing law, and I've been here ever since.
So you have a bachelor's in accounting, but then you went on to law school. So was law school always part of the path?
Yes, law school was always the goal, but I knew I didn't want to be like the lawyers you see on TV doing personal injury or even a criminal lawyer. I always knew I wanted to do business law.
So you didn't want to be, I guess the term is ambulance chaser.
No, I did not want to be an ambulance chaser.
Okay. Nay, nothing wrong with that. I guess it works for them.
Well, it's a lot of money, so I get it, but that just wasn't my passion.
I totally understand. So how long have you been practicing law?
12 years, going on 13.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you have worked with, corporate law and small business owners, entertainers. So, you've seen many different facets of law. Can you just give us a general idea, like what's one common mistake you see that could have been prevented with the right representation?
So usually the biggest mistakes that I see, especially with small business owners, is in the area of intellectual property. And so it usually comes one of two ways. Either they're infringing on somebody else's marks because they haven't done the research or they don't know how to do the research to determine if a name is available. So they will be full-fledged in business, online media, social media, website, everything already paid for, launched, branding done. And once the business takes off and it starts to become kind of popular, it catches the eye of the person who actually owns that brand. And then they will send them cease and desist letters, and then they'll reach out for attorney assistance to say, hey, I got this letter. Does it mean that I have to stop using this name, or what can I do? What are my options? So that's mistake number one. And then on the flip side of that is people will get a brand, spend a lot of money investing in, a graphic designer to make the brand, somebody to do their social media marketing and really focus on growing the brand, but then they don't protect it. And so I've also seen on the flip side clients who've spent, years developing a brand. Somebody notices this and says, oh, this is a great idea, but they don't have a trademark, or they did the trademark themselves and they didn't do it right. So it's in like an area that's not really applicable. And then the person goes and trademarks their brand and they want to fight about it. And that's much more expensive than just getting the brands protected up front.
I can believe that because there is a well-known singer right now who I believe is still battling someone else over trademark. And I think the lady had her name first. But it could have been a paperwork issue where she did the trademark paperwork herself in the other area. But I know for a couple of years they've been battling it out in court, and that's expensive.
That is very expensive because, if you look online, they'll tell you that to file a trademark with a lawyer's help, you're going to spend between, somewhere in that $1,000 to $2,000 price mark, right? But when you start getting into litigation, your filing fees are going to be almost $1,000. And then you figure the lawyer's going to charge you by the hour. And so you're going to hit that $1,000 to $2,000 before you even start. And you could have just paid the lawyer up front and not even have this issue to begin with and saved a lot of money.
Right, because when you're talking about litigation, you're not talking about just the court time. You're also talking about the research and the correspondence that happens outside of the court that you also have to pay for.
Yes, and so that's the other thing. So business lawyers work a lot different than ambulance chasers. And so sometimes when people are new in business and they work with a lawyer the first time, they're very confused by how business lawyers charge. So business lawyers don't work on contingency. So it's not a situation where the lawyer would file the lawsuit for you, and then if you win, they get a piece of it. The way that it would work is that you would pay a retainer up front, and they will work from that retainer based on their hourly rate. So for example, I have a client in DC who I do most of her legal work, but she has a separate family law issue, and I don't practice in family law. And so the person's retainer was $30,000, and her hourly rate is $400 an hour. So you will pay that $30,000, and she will take out $400 per hour that she works. But what clients really get confused about, so let's say in that you call me and the conversation is 15 minutes. Then what's going to happen is you'll see that you'll be billed for 0.2 or 0.3, depending on if the lawyer rounds up or down for the hour. And so you may see a charge for 0.3 for a phone call. And that's also sometimes confusing to new business owners because they're like, well, I just called you. I just had a really quick question. Well, the way the hourly billing works is that you get billed for the time that you use, whether it's a little bit of time or a lot of time. So litigation can be expensive. I generally tell clients on a low end, if they don't fight and you can get them dismissed, a case dismissed, you're still looking at about 10 grand.
To get a case dismissed.
Not to have your day in court. Like it goes well and they're like, I'm done, don't worry about it.
Wow. That's costly when you could have spent $2,000 in the beginning.
Very costly.
Prevented all of it.
Absolutely.
So in your expert opinion, and this is an opinion, anyone watching this is not legal advice for you to bet on, okay? You know that 100%. But you see a lot of things on Google as far as like you can Google and get contracts. There are these websites that are offering contracts and things for free. Is that a smart decision starting out as a way to cut corners to use Google to get your contracts and things done?
So what I would tell you is it depends on how risk averse you are and how much of a gambler you are. So the problem with Google is the same reason if you're in college and you're having to write a paper and you cite Google as a resource, you will get points off of your paper, is that Google isn't a verified place. So there's nothing to stop person A who has zero legal training and zero legal knowledge from typing out an agreement and posting it online and say, hey, I made a contract and here it is for free. I mean, there's no checkpoints on Google to make sure that things are accurate. So when you use Google, you use it at your own risk. The things that I will say are the biggest downfalls, at least if you are trying to use Google, is that to be aware that contracts are very state specific. And some things may even be city and county specific. So oftentimes I'll see clients, they'll say, well, I pulled this document from online. And I'm like, okay, well, most of it is fine, but there's some red flags here because in Georgia, the statute of limitations on this may be 5 years, or maybe the non-compete clause can only be 2 years in this state, whereas in another state it can be 5. And so if you have the 5-year provision in yours in a state that can only be 2, you may be in a situation where the court will disregard the whole entire agreement, even though everything else is right. And so just understanding the ramifications of the document. So, I'd say Google is probably your worst choice. There are some legal things. So like, for example, I don't recommend LegalZoom because generally LegalZoom is also not state specific, but at least there are some attorneys involved. I think it's some part of the process versus just getting any random document on Google and you don't know what you're looking at.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Now, you talked about the example of the client that you have. You deal with, some of her business stuff, but when she has family issues, that's a different law. And so I have personally seen where people have a real estate lawyer in their family, and they will have that person, to look over the contract, to even represent. There's even a documentary out about the Olympic bombing. And the guy who was slandered in the media, his lawyer was a real estate lawyer that helped him out because he needed help. I know it's not ideal, but if you have someone who has at least basic law knowledge, is that still better than Google?
Absolutely. So here's the thing. So law school is kind of like medical school. So at the end of the day, if you go to medical school, everybody learns the same base information. And then after that, people go on to specialize in certain things. So whether I'm a neurologist or a cardiologist, we all got the same base level education in medical school. So the same thing with law school. If I end up being a real estate lawyer, family lawyer, personal injury lawyer, at the end of the day, we all learn the same things. We just all decided to focus in different directions. And so while there are some things that are very specific to particular practice areas, if you had a choice of using Google versus a lawyer who went to school and has at least basic understanding of the law in general, you're going to be better off with a lawyer, even if it's not their area of expertise. So for example, that client that I've helped with in the family law situation, I have helped her in the family law situations for other things, and she represented herself because I provided her the information because she lives in a different state. And so my clients aren't just in Georgia, they're all over the country. So she lives in a different state, the laws are different. And so I can tell her generally, this is how family law works. These are the general things that you need to do. These are the things that you need to go. Here's where you can go to get templates specific for your state. Because family law is one of those things that people do represent themselves a lot. And so there are pro se websites that are sanctioned by the courts in most every state. So I can help her walk through the process and make sure she's doing it right, even though I don't practice in that particular area.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. So what we're seeing now, a lot of people are starting out doing something as a hobby.
Okay.
And then it takes off. And now they're like, okay, this could be a business. At what point would you recommend people start getting some kind of legal representation, or at least getting a lawyer to oversee what it is that you're doing once you kind of realize, like, okay, I went from this hobby that I'm making maybe $100 a month to now I'm looking at, I'm making a few $1,000s a month. I might want this to be a business.
So what I would say is when you get to the place where you can no longer absorb the risk, meaning that if something went wrong, would you be able to pay for it yourself out of pocket? And if the answer is no, then you're probably at that place where you need legal assistance. So for example, if I bake cakes for friends and I charge $30-$40, then if something goes wrong and I'm making cakes for friends, I probably can just make them another cake and it's not a big deal. Whereas if I'm making cakes and now I have a corporate client that says, hey, we're having a conference and I want 30 cakes, and something goes wrong, are you going to be able to handle that client and be okay afterwards and still be a viable business if you want the business to be sustained? Because that's generally what happens. People get caught up in something and it ends up being such that they end up having to close the business.
Yeah, that's not ideal. That's not the case. So what types of things does a person need to already be thinking about, and have what questions should they be prepared to answer when looking for a lawyer to help with their business?
So the first thing is, are you a business entity? So you can always be a sole proprietor, which means that you yourself are your business, but you have not registered with any government entity to have a formal business. So everything flows through you as a person, including the liability. Once you get to that place where, again, you don't feel comfortable being personally liable, that's when it's time to start thinking about, do I want to grow this business? And if so, then taking that next step of becoming an entity. And so thinking about what your goals are, whether it's I want to own this business forever by myself, or I plan to get outside investors, what do I want that to look like? Or if I want partners, how do I want that to look like? That's the time you start thinking, okay, I'm probably ready for legal assistance to help me figure out what entity would be best. And if I'm trying to bring other people in what capacity do I want to bring them in? And speaking of that, the other thing that I always tell business owners, so sometimes when people are doing things as a group, I'll get a call from one person And what I always tell people, if it's more than one person, you have to decide, do you want me to represent you or am I representing the business? Because my representation of you will be different than my representation of the business. So if I'm representing the business and it's 3 people in the group, then what needs to happen is that I talk to everybody and that everybody says, this is what we want our operating agreement, which is the agreement between the 3 members of the LLC, for example, to look like. We want it to be such that if somebody leaves, this is what happens. If we have to dissolve, this is what happens, etc. If I'm representing only you, then I can say, well, they're saying that they want it to be like this if y'all separate. This isn't good. This is bad for you. Here's what I would say if I were you in this position. Because if you're the one who's putting up the most money, or if you're the one who's putting up the most time, do you really think it's fair to split everything in 3 equal parts? So that's the difference when you're deciding whether you want the lawyer to represent an individual versus the lawyer to represent the business.
That makes sense. So what about everyone that wants to start a nonprofit? You know, do you need to get lawyers involved when we're talking about a nonprofit?
So it really just depends on how sophisticated the people who are starting the business are, because the paperwork is online through the IRS, and if you feel comfortable doing it, I don't think it's something that you cannot do on your own. If it just, like I say, it depends on your level of sophistication, how much time and research you're willing to put in it to do the paperwork right. Because if you don't do it right, it's the IRS, they're going to reject it, and you basically start over and pay the filing fees again. It's no harm, no foul. You just, repay the filing fees, and it slows down the process. The main thing that people don't always understand with nonprofits is that you're not the owner. So sometimes people are like, oh, I want to own a nonprofit. Nonprofits don't have owners.
Wow. Now that I did not know.
Yes, you don't own it. So the board is who's responsible for it, but nobody owns a nonprofit.
The board is okay, because you just blew my mind with that one. I didn't, because I have heard people say they own a nonprofit. I've heard that multiple times.
No, you don't own nonprofits. They are entities that function as their own separate entity, just like a business would, except for businesses have owners. Nonprofits don't have owners. They have boards of directors who serve as the governing body for that organization. So you can have a founder, you can have a board chair, you can have a president, but all those people are replaceable. So if you want this to be your personal family business, then arguably a nonprofit isn't the way, because if you have a board, the board could vote you and all your family members out, just depending on how you structure it, because your board cannot also, that's the other thing people don't know, your board can't be 100% family members. So it is possible to lose control of a board and ownership, I guess, of a board or a nonprofit that you create.
Okay, wow, that just, I'm spinning right now off of that, because I did not know that. But I don't own a nonprofit. I am a part of something. I've never claimed to own one. So can you claim to be a nonprofit without having done the 501c3?
Sure. So as a part of your state registration, you can register as a state nonprofit. You just don't get the benefits of a nonprofit. So which is mainly that when you go to purchase things, you don't have to pay taxes. And the same thing when people make donations to you is tax exempt. So then you can say, well, I am a nonprofit, but you're not a 501c3 nonprofit.
Oh, okay. All right. Did not know that there was a difference there. It's real important. So what about the people transitioning, wanting to go from being sole proprietor to incorporated? Because I see, I'm seeing a lot of that online now. People are saying that they are incorporated, or they looking to become a corporation, and they were a sole proprietor. I know lawyers got to get involved there. I'm guessing. I didn't go to law school, but I feel like you need a lawyer.
So that's what I was talking about with that entity selection. So the most common entities that people choose would be an S corp, a C corp, a LLC, or a partnership. And so that's one of the things. That's why I say you really want to talk to a lawyer to determine like what your goals are. Is it going to be a single owner of this business? Are there going to be multiple owners? Do you want investors who give you money but don't have a lot of say? Or do you want the people who invest in your business to be equal partners? So you really can flush through what the person's goals are for the business to find the entity that matches their goals the best. And the other thing that people don't realize is you can change entity types. The IRS does not like you to flip-flop, but you can, start off as a partnership and then transition to a corporation or vice versa. So that is an option that people have. You can start one way and then change to something else.
Okay, well, that's great advice. So you also you have founded a nonprofit yourself. Will you tell us about your nonprofit?
Sure. So I founded Nick's Kicks in honor of my late husband, Nicholas Rogers. And if you knew him, you knew that he loved sneakers, especially Jordans and Foamposites. And a friend of the family kind of takes in young fellas. And at Christmas, I decided to give one of the young fellas a pair of sneakers out of Nick's collection. And my son at the time had a holy fit. Like, these are my daddy's shoes. What are you doing? So we talked about it, and we talked about giving. And so when we talked about it, his thing was, well, why don't we give people shoes, but from the store? And not from daddy's personal collection. And so that's kind of how we came up with Nick's Kicks. And so through Nick's Kicks, our first initiative is doing sneaker shopping sprees, which we basically take youth from middle school, and we're expanding hopefully this year when things get a little bit more normal to also include elementary schools. And we take them on shoe shopping sprees, give them a budget of $150 and allow them to get as few or as many sneakers as they choose. Some kids are very frugal and they decide they're going to get a couple of pairs. Some kids, want the shoes that they've always dreamed of, that they've never been able to get, and they get that one pair. But we are using that shoe experience as a gateway. We really want to also teach a couple of other things through that process. And so we've been working with a principal to try to figure out a way in which we can have a deeper connection with the school, because we really would like to teach some financial literacy and financial responsibility, as well as encourage everybody to take better care of themselves and their bodies, and to really have an understanding of what health means, and just being physically active, because kids don't go outside like they used to. And if you knew Nick, he was very much into sports and athletics. And so he loved to be active and work out and kickball and softball and just being, competitive. And so we also want to pass on that spirit in his honor as well.
So that's, of course, I might be slightly biased, but I think that is that's a great platform to build. And so anyone who is familiar with me, that Nicholas Rogers was very dear to me. I mention him all the time because I was beyond inspired by him. And so I just love that. And kids' shoes make a big difference, because I've been in education for a while, and shoes plays a big part in confidence, because kids don't want to be excluded. They don't want to feel singled out. And, even in schools where they wear uniforms, their sneakers are their individuality. So it makes a big difference.
Absolutely. That's kind of what we figured, because at this point, most schools do require uniforms, but it's the sneakers that end up getting kids teased, because even though we all have on the same uniform, if I have the latest and the greatest shoes and you have on shoes from Walmart, then the kids are still going to tease you and still make fun of you. And it just becomes a sore spot for kids, especially, I think probably about third grade is when kids really start paying attention to brands and really caring about what their friends think and what their friends say about what they're wearing.
I agree. I totally agree. My kids are now at the age where they're starting to be interested more in shoes and sports and things like that. My oldest will be 10 soon, and I'm really seeing he no longer wants to light up shoes, the shoes with Spider-Man and those things on it. Now he's talking about Air Max, and I'm like, Air Max? Whoa.
Right.
Totally. So, before we wrap up, what is your advice for anyone watching this that has a small business but has not talked to a lawyer, but business is really booming and it's like, well, so far, I've been good with LegalZoom, or, maybe I do need to talk to someone. Like, what is your advice beyond, are you still willing to absorb the risk in case something happens?
So what I will say is that even for cost-conscious clients, what I always would recommend is that to say, hey, pay for a consultation with a lawyer, sit down, come up with your questions, and pay for a legal consultation. Because while lawyers don't give free legal advice, during a paid consultation, they will give you legal advice related to your questions. So it may be enough to point you in the right direction to say, okay, hey, I have this contract. Can I pay you an hour to review it? That it doesn't mean they're going to fix it, but they can write up, scratch out, point out the areas that need your attention, or explain the areas that they think that you need to change, and give you some advice on why and what you should change it to. And so even though you can say, okay, well, I may not have $1,000 to spend, you probably can, spare $250 or $500 to talk to a lawyer for a couple of hours to get some straight up clear legal advice, and to look over the things that you've been doing to see if it's okay or if you should be doing something else. And that's like a really cheap entryway into legal advice. And a great way to fill out a lawyer too, because what I tell people is lawyers are very different, right? And so it's almost like dating. You have to find the lawyer that best fits your personality. So you might like a lawyer who sugarcoats. You might like a lawyer who's more direct. You might like a lawyer who's very, very responsive. Or you may be okay with a lawyer taking 24 hours to get back to you, because you're going to take 24 hours to get back to them. So it's kind of like dating. You really got to know what it is you like in a business relationship, and then find an attorney who can match that, because the attorney-client privilege or attorney-client relationship really works best when you trust your lawyer. If your lawyer tells you something and you're like, oh, I don't think she knows what she's talking about, or I don't think I'm going to do that, then you've wasted your time and your money, because you're now paying for legal advice that you're going to completely disregard. And if you really trusted your lawyer, you wouldn't do that. So treat it like a relationship, feel a person out, ask to say, can we have a quick conversation on Zoom? I just want to get a feel for you, the way you work, and see before you hire a lawyer.
Great advice. Date before you marry, people. Date before you marry the lawyer, date the lawyer. That's great. That's great advice. All right. So any closing remarks, Maya, before we end this interview?
Well, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to join us today. This speaks volumes about what you're trying to do with your business, if you're taking the time to better yourself and learn more about different aspects of business to make your business stronger. So kudos to you. Keep up the good work. And here's to much success in 2021. And thank you, Kim, for having me.
Thank you so much for being a part of this. All right. So everyone watching this, you got a ton of notes. You have a ton of notes. Maya gave great usable advice about small business when it comes to the law. So listen, continue watching the interviews of the Women of Influence Summit 2021. Again, I am your host, Kimberly Lawson. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful day. Stay tuned.